We're pretty deep into Gordon at this point, and he's mainly focused on how technology transformed consumption in the US household. Economists often focus on consumption as this ultimate goal of economic activity, but there are really important intermediary goals, namely production. So just as the network household transformed consumption, so too did the network firm transform production. I want to start with this graph. It shows the US balance of trade as a percent of GDP from 1800 to 2020 or so. If it's above zero, that means the US is a net exporter of goods. If it's below zero, it means the US was a net importer of goods. We're going to focus on the latter two periods, but I do want to talk briefly about the transition between the earliest period and the middle period. During this time, 1800 to 1870, the US was still exporting a lot, even though they were a net importer. It's just a lot of what they were exporting were low-value agricultural goods and raw materials, so timber, wheat, things like that. And it really wasn't until 1870 or 1880 when the US started to industrialize enough that it could start exporting higher-value manufactured goods. So it's always important to remember when talking about balances of trade, we're not really talking about physical quantities, we're talking about dollar values. So the price of the good you export really matters. In the latter period, the US became a net importer again. And what really enabled this was the globalization of production and the formation of something called global value chains that we're going to talk about here in a bit. And none of that would have been possible without innovations in communications and transportation. But let's make this more concrete. Let's talk about shoes for a second. A manufacturer deciding where they're going to base production really only cares about one thing: cost of production. And for a really, really long time, cost of productions tended to be lowest near to where the good would be sold. The only things that we really did long-distance trade in long ago were really, really high-value commodities like gold. There are some good reasons for that. We're talking about a world that moved at the speed of a horse. Even if you only moved production a couple of counties over, it was still much more difficult to supervise production because you had to get on a horse and ride half a day to go get there. Likewise, it was also immensely expensive to move finished goods or intermediate goods around. And there are a few ways of solving this problem. One solution in the pre-industrial period was something called the putting out system, also sometimes called domestic production. And this illustration is from the 1500s, but the system really persisted from 1500s in Europe all the way to the mid-1800s in the US. And what it consists of is a merchant providing raw materials to families who then refine those materials into either shoe parts or final shoes. The merchant goes around and collects those whenever they're done and pays them based on how many units they produced. There's not a lot to do for a farmer in a New England winter, and so this made a lot of sense. Now, by paying families based on how much they produce, the merchant incentivizes those families to produce as much as possible from the provided raw materials. And it also gives the merchant an option of withholding pay for substandard goods. This sort of piece rate pay is one way that the merchant could control production without supervising production. But there are some limitations to this system. It doesn't scale well. The merchant has to be able to travel to all the families that he needs to see in a single season. And it also runs into problems when production starts to industrialize. So now it's 1880, and our shoe merchant has a big expensive machine that needs to keep going to produce shoes. Every minute that machine sits idle, the merchant is foregoing some revenue. So what does he do? Instead of going around to all these different families who then get to run production on their own, he centralizes production in a factory. So he can walk the line, he can keep an eye on how production is going. And this is also when those piece rates I talked about started to fall out of favor. Instead, we get wage labor. But most shoes used in New England were still produced near to New England at this time. What's keeping our shoemaker from moving production from New England to Qing Dynasty China in 1870? And why does he have to wait another 100 years to move production to Deng Xiaoping's Communist China? Well, in 1870, our shoe merchant doesn't have a good way of monitoring production abroad. It's also immensely expensive to get those shoes across the Pacific. What he needs is a way to talk to the factory manager in Guangdong, and he needs a cheap way to get those shoes to the West Coast. And between 1870 and 1970, he gets both. Getting a call through to China was possible but unreliable. The first trans-Pacific cable isn't completed until 1964. That made communication much more reliable, but it wasn't even linked into China until much later. We also get the containerization of maritime transportation, those standardized shipping containers. And this, along with much larger vessels, leads to falling maritime transportation costs, and those costs really continue to fall up until about the 1990s. It also doesn't hurt that by 1980, China had had 3 decades to stabilize and industrialize following their civil war. Mind you, this is all a simplification for the sake of the narrative. All this stuff is going on, but production was also offshored to many other countries, and there's a lot of other technological and governmental machinery that was needed to make all this happen. We're just breaking off a small piece of the bigger picture. But the sum effect of all of this is that we end up with global value chains. The basic idea is that different steps in the production process generate more or less profit. There are high profit activities like design and marketing, and there are lower profit activities like manufacturing. And what a lot of firms were able to do with better communication and transportation technology is to push these lower profit activities off onto firms in developing countries, where labor costs tend to be lower. But to maintain that global value chain, the lead firm has to ensure standards of production. Just like our New England shoe merchant, they can refuse to accept substandard goods. But that's really costly for both sides. So we end up with systems of inspection, their pre-shipment inspection by third-party firms, and all of this helps them to maintain standards of quality. And they really want to maintain those standards of quality because a lot of the high-value activities, R&D, design, marketing, and such, those things are about building a brand image. So a company like Apple really benefits from having a reputation for having a consistent standard of quality in their products. And if suddenly that starts to slip, then a lot of their market power disappears. People will no longer, trust that they provide high quality goods, so they might buy something else. Companies have a lot of ways of ensuring that what gets produced meets their standards, but for a really long time, they did not care about how production actually took place inside those factories. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this leads to a lot of unsavory labor practices popping up in their supply chains. Knowledge of this really kicked off in 2002 with an Oxfam report on coffee production. A lot of coffee growers were, basically operating at a loss, and it was having major negative consequences for their livelihoods. But more recently, scrutiny has been aimed at Nestle and Nike for forced labor and slavery showing up in their supply chains. Much of the value of these companies is related to having that recognizable brand we talk about, and that brand reputation is what allows them to sit as the gatekeeper between producers and consumers. So, at least in the case of coffee, the naming and shaming that really fell out of this Oxfam report really did work and helped improve the lives of coffee farmers. This is where we get fair trade labeling and the like. But because big companies have offloaded production, it gives them a lot of times limited tools to deal with the poor labor standards in their supply chains. So much of it really comes down to inspection and the threat of the big company no longer contracting with them. Perhaps surprisingly, Walmart is a success story here. In past decades, they've received a lot of criticism and scrutiny over child labor showing up in their supply chains. And now one condition of being a supplier to Walmart is not having children working in your factory and submitting to random inspection to ensure that there aren't any children working in your factory. And for a lot of these small suppliers, getting that contract with Walmart is a make or break thing. And Walmart can pay a higher premium because of their market power in the West that allows them to kind of, through this loose mechanism, enforce higher labor standards, getting rid of child labor in this case. The big contrast here is that product standard surveillance is kind of easy. Does the phone do what you expect it to do? But labor standard surveillance is much harder because a phone made with child labor is indistinguishable from a phone made not with child labor in most cases. and companies have little incentive to address these labor standards issues until there's some measure of public scrutiny that hurts their brand. Offshoring has largely been limited to physical goods. Food delivery and taxi rides, they're not so easily outsourced. By their nature, they have to be produced near to where they're consumed. And so thinking back to our global value chain diagram, a lot of things that Uber and Amazon and other platforms offload to independent contractors, they're the same kinds of activities that manufacturers offshored in earlier decades. Uber does a lot of marketing and development of their technology, but leaves the actual moving of people from A to B onto some poor independent contractor. Amazon, too, often shoves the task of getting a package to your door onto an independent contractor who's not an employee of Amazon. And so, in both cases, the entity that's actually providing the service is separate from the platform that you transact with. Now, there's an important distinction here between the rise of offshoring and the rise of platforms. The innovations that Gordon credits with the improvement in the American standard of living are the same ones that enabled offshoring. But the more recent innovations that he deems less important to growth, like the internet and mobile computing, those are the same innovations that enabled labor platforms to exist. Wrapping up, developments in communication and transportation enabled the network household, but it also enabled a networked firm. Networked firms can more easily offshore production onto smaller firms, but doing so can diminish labor standards. Subsequent developments in communication that enabled offshoring abroad eventually developed into stuff that allowed labor platforms to exist at home. And finally, platform labor and offshoring serve similar functions for the firm, that is to shed lower profit activities, but it does so for different markets. So one's primarily a goods-based thing, one's primarily a service-based thing. Well, that's all I got. Thanks.